Good evening and welcome. My name is David Hickton, and I am the director of the Pitt Cyber Institute for Law, Policy, and Security. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the 24th Annual McLean Lecture on behalf of Chancellor Pat Gallagher and Pitt Law Dean Chip Carter. As you'll hear in a moment, we have a very distinguished speaker who we welcome back to the university for the second time in 2 months, our good friend and my colleague, former colleague, Luke Dembosky, a graduate of the law school class of 1994, who has a very distinguished biographical record which Professor Brand will share with you. And before I introduce Professor Brand to do that, I want to just take a brief moment to talk to you about the new institute that was the brainchild of the Chancellor and the Provost in consultation with several of the deans. We have an interdisciplinary institute here on cyber, which involves many of the schools in the university. It's an exciting time for the cyber discussion, and it is our intention to invest further on behalf of this community and this institution to do our part to make sure that all things cyber, people are looking to Pittsburgh for the answers. So we're very excited about it, and we're very grateful that tonight's speaker joined us on our inaugural event on February 2nd. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Ron Brand, who is the Chancellor Mark Nordenberg University Professor, the John E. Murray Faculty Scholar, and the Director of the Center for International Legal Education. Ron is very well respected within the Pittsburgh legal community, the national legal community, and indeed around the world as a leader in legal education, and it is my great privilege to introduce him to you so he can introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I want to add my welcome to this event, to both the School of Law and to the 24th Annual McLean Lecture on World Law. This is the premier lecture each year on international legal matters at the School of Law. In past years, this lecture series has hosted speakers that include 2 judges on the International Court of Justice, members of the Nuremberg prosecution team, the first woman judge on the European Court of Justice, former attorneys general of both the U.S. and Canada, the Solicitor General of Australia, the President Judge of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and judges from the Supreme Courts of Norway and the Constitutional Court of Kosovo, among other noted international scholars, professors, and practitioners. Our Center for International Legal Education is proud to continue the tradition of this lecture, which was created to honor the memory of Mac McLean. Mac was a founder of the World Federalist Association and the World Federalist Movement, both in Pittsburgh and around the world. He was also a vibrant part of the Pittsburgh international community and was dedicated to the idea that the expansion of the rule of law and the creation of a functioning international legal system is the best way to ensure lasting peace and justice throughout the world. I want to thank our law firm sponsors, Sherrard, German, and Kelly, for their generous support of the reception that will take place immediately following the program in the Alcoa room on the 2nd floor. And I invite you to join us there for refreshments and continued discussion at that time. While this is the premier international lecture each year at the law school, it is one of many programs that are sponsored by our Center for International Legal Education. I want to take just a moment to mention 2 coming programs in particular that might be of interest to the members of this audience. On Monday, April 17 at 12:30 p.m. in room 109, Charles Kotubi, a 2001 Pitt Law graduate, and Luke Sabota will speak on their new book, General Principles of Law and International Due Process. That book is published as part of the CILE Studies series that is published by Oxford University Press. The book is a groundbreaking update of the 1954 work on general principles of law published by Professor Ben Ching. For practicing lawyers in the audience, I want to mention our annual summer school with the University of Verona on transnational commercial agreements, litigation, and arbitration, which will be held in Vicenza, Italy on May 22 to 26. There is material on both of these programs on your way in and out of this room. The Vicenza program allows Pennsylvania lawyers to get 24 hours of substantive and 2 hours of ethics CLE credit in 1 week in a wonderful location. So if you're interested, please let us know. We'd be happy to welcome you there. Each year, the McLean Lecture provides insight into important legal and global relationships and to individual lives and to peace. This year, we are thrilled to welcome back to Pitt Law one of our own graduates who has been at the center of activities that today are the subject of front page news and congressional hearings. Luke Dembosky is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Debevoise Plimpton. He joined that firm 1 year ago after serving as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he oversaw DOJ's first national security cyber portfolio. Mr. Dembosky was the senior DOJ official on the Target, Sony Pictures, Home Depot, Anthem, and OPM breaches, among many others, and received the Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award for leading the GameOver Zeus botnet takedown. His roles at the DOJ included Deputy Chief for Litigation at the Computer Crime and IP Section, and DOJ Representative at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He participated in the negotiation of a 2013 cyber accord with Russia and the historic five-point agreement signed by President Obama and President Xi Jinping of China in 2015. Prior to his work at DOJ in Washington, Mr. Dembosky served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Western District of Pennsylvania with our own then U.S. attorney, David Hickton. They prosecuted some of the earliest and most significant cybercrime cases, including the Iceman case, which involved a massive theft of credit cards and other information from financial institutions and resulted in what was then the longest hacking sentence in U.S. history. In his current work, Mr. Dembosky advises companies on managing cyber risks, responding to cyber incidents, and handling related litigation matters. It is indeed my privilege and my pleasure to welcome back one of our own as this year's McLean Lecturer for tonight's particularly timely lecture on cyber law, policy, and security issues in the new age of nationalism. Please join me in welcoming Luke Dembosky.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Brand. It's really an honor to be here, and hearing the list of previous speakers that you've had come through for this lecture is incredibly humbling and intimidating at the same time. But it was a great honor, and it was frankly a huge surprise to me to get the call from Professor Brand a few months ago to be given such an honor, and it's wonderful to be back here at Pitt to share what I know about this subject. And that's also a caveat because I don't know everything about this subject. So I'm hoping to give you a bit of a Shakespearean view, something for everybody. Yes, it will have geopolitical macro issues, but also some of the things in the trenches that I've had a chance to see over a career of learning about how to do these cases, making a lot of mistakes along the way, graduating into diplomatic and bureaucratic ranks, and seeing how some of the choices that are made at the higher levels of government can impact those things in the trenches. And that's why I'm calling it Shakespearean, because I think it really, the goal is not to give you an overview, it's not to be completely in the weeds, but to give you, to steal a term from my wife's world of geology, a core sample of the issues, some scoped out at the macro level and some very much in the weeds. And then to have a chance to receive your questions and do my best to answer them. So with that, I think we'll jump in. I think we have an hour, and we'll save at least 10 minutes or more. And I am very flexible. I can go on talking for hours and days if need be, but I hope that you'll have questions and you will not be shy about asking them. So I thought that I would divide this as follows. First, give you an idea of what the actual threat picture is and how it's evolved over time. I started doing these cases in 2002. I knew next to nothing about this world before that day when I walked into the U.S. Attorney's Office in Pittsburgh, and they told me that since I was the youngest person there, I must know all about computers, which was quite hilarious given how much I actually knew. But they train you, and they don't let you fail, and you see a lot of things, and you make your mistakes, and you learn and grow as a lawyer working in the space. Then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking at a high level about some of the reactions of the U.S. government, particularly under the Obama administration, to this swirl of threats that we're seeing, and some of what the EU and others are doing. And then talk about what it means if we really are in this age of nationalism. We can debate whether we're in an international age of nationalism given the results of the Dutch election and where France may be heading. But we certainly know we have a nationalistic surge of sorts here in the US, and we can talk about what this all means against that backdrop. And then some thoughts on where we might go from here. What are the issues? I'll be honest with you about what I know and don't know, about areas that if you're perhaps a student or you're looking to research, where there's fertile ground for issues that folks haven't necessarily plumbed the depths of. So with that, we'll go into the cast of characters that are involved here. And I've been a little bit biased here because some of these were my customers, so to speak, and some were a partner of mine, Jim Pastore, but they happen to be some of the significant cases. And our own dear Dave Hickton, in his U.S. Attorney days, was a leader on a number of these. In particular, the criminal set is represented by the top two on the left. The Guy Fawkes mask you'll recognize comes from the hacktivist group Anonymous, seemingly bent on destruction, although I'm hearing of late interested in central banks. As of a few days ago, started to surface that they're looking at central banks. So maybe they've lost their ideological motive and they're interested more in what car they're going to drive or their retirement prospects. My partner Jim Pastore prosecuted the last iteration of their leadership, and they went off on 10-year sentences, but they have a renewed crop of people that come up through the ranks. The guy on the left, Yevgeny Bogachev, Russian national. It's rare to see a wanted poster in a cybercrime case. This was something we pushed for when we realized that this is not somebody who travels much, and if you can put a $3 million reward on someone's head who's caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage as a hacker, that's worth doing. More about him in a few minutes. On the top right is really the seminal breakthrough in the national security space, courtesy of Dave's leadership and others in Pittsburgh, and with some support from where I eventually worked, the National Security Division. I did not work on this case. I was in the criminal division at this time, but it's the case against the 5 members of the People's Liberation Army that I think was the huge shot across the bow, or shot wherever you want to say, that was the impetus that led to our eventual agreement that Ron mentioned with China. And we'll talk about that in the government reactions. The bottom left is what the Sony employees saw on their screens when North Korea lashed out at them over a movie they didn't like. And the bottom right represents sort of the blurred area of Iranian activity in this space, where groups acting arguably in association with the government have been active against U.S. interests as publicly reported, including carrying out over 170 days of denial of service attacks against the U.S. financial sector. So how has it evolved? In the beginning, which is before my time doing these cases, really in the early and mid-90s, you had mostly lone wolf actors, and a lot of them were not so commercially oriented. They were, to use a legal term of art, punks. They were bent on sabotaging and defacing websites. They sat there with a stack of pizza boxes and Mountain Dews or whatever they're drinking now, and they caused destruction. And their current iteration are groups like Anonymous that are far more sophisticated and scales up to thousands of people participating in the attack. So there's still some piece of each of these threads, but it's matured. Beginning in the 90s, we started to see them start to congregate online in these underground forums, known as carding forums, named after credit card, with credit card theft as a primary motive. They're still called forums, but it's less about your credit card, more about much bigger ticket items, although they will take the low-lying fruit as well. Eastern Europe was the first place where people came together. People have speculated as to why that is. You have and had high math and science talent, and you had a collapsed economy and people that lost opportunity and the ability to make a living, so to say. But you had a long history of organized crime, and you had organized crime taking off in earnest, and certainly in the early and mid-90s in Russia, Ukraine, and other parts of the former Soviet Union. And these groups became quite good, and they started to work together. Western groups were behind, and they hit the stage in a big way in the early 2000s. And the Iceman case that Professor Brand mentioned is the character behind the Carter's Market, which was the first real challenge to the Russian and Ukrainian carding groups. And it was a real organized group with people that specialized in mimicking Visa holograms. So-and-so was really good at cash out in these circumstances. This person good at penetrating certain types of systems, led by this Iceman character that we mentioned. Then you started to see cottage industries come up to serve this growing market. If you're going to be a bad guy, you need places to put your stuff online. You don't want it to be your home. Everybody started to realize that if the trail comes right back to you, that's not good no matter where you are, even if you're in another country somewhere. So they started to find places that would be the trove of their tools and their stolen wares, and they could access this remotely. The place wouldn't keep records. No one would be auditing it. It's run by bad guys for a fee. Hard to prosecute, because you have to show knowledge, so we would have to be creative and show that the criminal conduct had so permeated this hosting enterprise that they couldn't possibly think that they were doing a wholesome business. But the problem is, like a lot of these early large groups, they were also operating overseas in places like Odessa and Ukraine. Specialization in infrastructure building, the groups started to look for people who had particular skill sets. They were all technically pretty good, but some would major in certain aspects of the scheme. In particular, some were very good at developing, you heard the phrase botnet, an army of compromised computers. They would run a malware campaign to infect thousands or millions of machines, and these would report to a central command and control server, and this still goes on today. It's very common now, but when I started, a big botnet was 5,000 or 10,000 infected computers. Now easily 5-10 million, and actually they've surpassed what they would like, and they keep it at a sweet spot of between 1 and 5 million because it's more manageable. Because they could make it 100 million or whatever they wanted, really. And they use the botnet in various ways. One is to carry out offensive attacks, to flood people's systems and knock them offline, sometimes for a fee. Others use, like the GameOver Zeus botnet, it's a network to funnel wire transfers out of banks and financial institutions, bounce them around so they're untraceable, and send them out to bad guy-controlled infrastructure. The infrastructure is important because you're starting to see some of this in announcements like Yahoo, which I can talk about because I wasn't there and I don't have any inside information. But you see that the way to identify these people is not just that a trail leads to their house, but it's known infrastructure, known MO or signatures, known components to the malware and tools, associations with certain people and cash out facilities that they use, that all come together to tell you that you have a probable case. Often that's the most you're going to get, that a certain group or individual was behind something. Now we see the very top groups have vertical integration. I'll give you a very specific example of this. We started to see the first signs of cyber-fueled insider trading in the mid to late 2000s. So there were groups that they didn't quite know how to carry out trades to sell short or capitalize on their position in the market, but they could hack and get into systems of people who had valuable inside information pre-release. And so what they did is they would hack financial news services like PR Newswire and others and get the stories that were about to be released that would affect the market. And they didn't know how to carry out the trades, so they prearranged the sale to traders to carry out the trades. Now what you see are groups that bring this talent on their team, and they don't also chase your credit cards. They're not even interested in that. There's a group, for example, called Fin4 that security researchers have known about since about 2013, that really they speak Wall Street fluently. They study the rhythm of a deal and a trade. They figure out what lawyers, what bankers and people are at the table. They start out with an email infection. They watch the traffic. They'll take one of the documents that's part of the discussion and they'll lace it with malware. They'll then compromise that email account and send it to one of the other parties in the deal, and they work their way into understanding the timing of a trade or transaction, merger, acquisition, and they're netting hundreds of millions of dollars a year. They don't need your credit card. It's not for them. They specialize in that. And when the email comes to you, it's not from the Nigerian prince. It is Wall Street speak. It's absolutely perfectly in keeping with the transaction you're running. So they've brought this talent on their team, and they may take certain commoditized services from the underground market, but the real talent and the core of their profit is controlled by them. Here's a new flavor that we're seeing, which are destructive attacks. And these have huge stakes not only for individuals and businesses, but also for our economy and critical infrastructure writ large. We saw this in Sony, where the company is hit with a crippling attack, unable to operate their systems, has to go down for some period of time. Many people didn't know about an earlier attack that was even worse in 2012 against the Saudi state-owned entity, Saudi Aramco. In 2012, they lost essentially their entire network. They lost between 30 and 35,000 systems. Sony, on the other hand, was able to recover. There was a bold decision to shut off Sony's network. That was the difference between losing everything and being able to be back on your feet in some period of days. Saudi Aramco effectively lost their network, and it was a devastating and costly blow. What we're seeing now are the ability to take not only individuals and businesses' PCs that you've infected and brought into your army, but also to take routers, cameras, and other things that you've seen. And these have been manufactured in the same sort of, the best way you could say it would be naive way that a lot of the internet and security was designed historically, thinking that people would only use it for good and never for evil. When you leave an open password or a default simple password on someone's router, camera, television, and the bad guys know that, they know people are not resetting their passwords on these things. They send out blanket malware, and they now take their army of 5 million to 25 million. And so this is what happened when Netflix and some others were knocked off the offline in the fall, it was such a powerful attack against dying systems, the one in the middle. In Finland, the banks saw a similar attack last year. Brian Krebs is a security researcher, and he's not a big favorite of the hacking community because he outs them and he talks about them, exercising his free speech rights. They don't like that. They blow him out of the water offline for some period of time. People donate time and resources to help Brian stay online, but only so long until it starts costing hundreds of thousands of dollars a day, and then they're not going to help Brian anymore. So, this begs the question, what's the government's role when the private sector is attacked? What are the legal implications of these issues? Where does liability fall? Who's responsible for locking these things down? Is the answer more regulation? Is it the ability, to bring a consumer suit or have the FTC or another consumer agency act on your behalf? And what is that going to look like under the Trump administration? I don't want to spend much time here because we're probably all tired of having a stack of these letters on our desk of all the places our stuff has been compromised and everybody offering us credit monitoring. I had the joy of being part of the OPM hack as somebody with a clearance, and then having the insult to injury of being in charge of responding to this for the DOJ. And OPM was a painful, you can't call it a shot across the bow. It's sort of the theft of the holy grail of information about individuals for the government. A terrible disaster for the country for 21.5 million cleared people to lose their entire background check. And then these others have affected the public at large. The email accounts like Yahoo are suggestive of a different trend. And I think it's one that has the potential to cut across criminal and nation-state activity. And that is a movement to what I call, this is my phrase, it may not be the best phrase, profile building on a massive scale, where you're not getting from Yahoo anybody's bank account number or anything. You're getting just an email account, an email address. It's a step or two removed, at least, from you monetizing this. Or if you're an intelligence service, you would combine that with somebody's social media data and other publicly available sourced information, things that you can subscribe to. You would combine that hacked information. You would build out a profile of the person. Well, somebody or somebodies have been very active the last few years on building out massive scale profiles of Americans and other Western citizens. Critical infrastructure, ironically, it's not been, everybody's worried about privacy, and we should be very worried about privacy issues. But one consideration, to steal one of the things that is food for thought going forward, is should we spend some time prioritizing the protection of critical infrastructure for a while? We've had a very healthy and robust debate about encryption, about other issues as a society. Post-Snowden, we've all been debating and talking about these issues and having soul-searching issues, but I don't want the power plant to blow up either, or rioting to be on the streets, or anybody to be locked out of their accounts because the trading platform went down. So we got to spend time putting that issue in priority as well. This is highlights the risk to the central banks, the SWIFT system hacks that started last year. From what I'm told, they're still not under control. There's been a loss of confidence in the system, and it exploits the international aspect of the system in that banks here can lock it down. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York can lock down the system in their role, but the weakest link can be another bank overseas. And these banks are interconnected in the system. And many of them, from what we're hearing, don't know how many people have administrative level access to this system, don't know who's left or what controls are still on or off. And this is a huge issue when $81 million in one shot goes out the door. So we have to lock this system down and other systems that support it, while at the same time having the discussion of what are the right controls on government overreach from a privacy standpoint. In the nation-state space, here I'm confined as somebody who was in charge of national security hacking cases. I have to stick to the publicly reported stuff, and I think there's a lot of very good stuff out there. The Director of National Intelligence put out threat assessments about this, and what you see is a lot of more players, a lot of additional players getting active in the national security cyberspace. Yes, you have Russia, you have China, you have the US. Every developed country has a national security cyber program. And so it's no secret that leading countries conduct cyber espionage. And that's something that President Obama and others acknowledged in the face of this. But as was laid stark in the China debate, one thing we don't do as a country is steal trade secrets from public companies and provide them to their competitors in the US market. We don't do that. Others have done that, and that's been a big source of contention. You have a whole discussion about norms of behavior. Here's basically how it games out. There's only so many Jeffersonian-style democracies in the world. I mean, you can strike the Jeffersonian part. There's only so many democracies in the world. There's a lot more dictatorships, third world potentates, and so forth. And they would love to outvote the democratic-leaning countries that happen to be the ones behind the formation of the internet. They would love to see that infrastructure turned over as an instrument of control and perpetuation of their power. And so the Russias and Chinas of the world would love to see it turned over to the UN, at a minimum the G77, because guess what? The numbers are in their favor there. The US, the UK, other Five Eyes countries, not so much. Wait a minute, we created this wonderful, beautiful, open, multi-stakeholder platform. You want to turn it over to police states? We're hesitant to do that. And so the resistance is there to a UN treaty in this regard. The US has historically opposed this. Russia has been, very much active in the international space on these issues. The UN GGE, group of government experts, I was part of this a couple years ago. You go to the UN and you all sit around and everybody brings in their proposals. Russia was really smart to form this group a few years ago. Well, it goes back more than 10 years ago. But they have tremendous leadership in this space. Their so-called cyber czar is somebody that I had a chance to meet with on a regular basis in diplomatic negotiations and settings, and they're impressive. And they see a path to dislodging what they view as internet dominance and control by the US and the West more broadly from that, dislodging us from that control in their view. And so part of this was the decision to wrest control of internet governance from ICANN, which had been tied to the US and to Commerce Department. So they've been chipping away at this for some years. It'd be interesting, in light of all the public reports about the US election, what happens at the UN GGE this summer. And I've heard murmurings that, that it could actually be a loss of credibility for Russia going into the UN GGE. I don't know, but it's one thing to pound the table when the US is sitting there trying to explain the Snowden incident. It's another thing when you're sitting there trying to explain the election hacking and so forth that you've been accused of. And I'm not passing any judgment on what's happened and not happened or what actually is what, but these are issues of perception and public and government perception, and they are very real. You see rogue states like North Korea and in Iran, I would call probably also rogue state in my view, but certainly North Korea doesn't get much more rogue than that. It's hard to do much to them. There was a sanctions package already for them, but when you don't have much international surface area in business or commerce, it's pretty hard to penalize you. When your people aren't traveling and there's no really way to get at them, it's difficult. the only leverage is through their one patron in the world, China. And so far, that's been difficult for China to control North Korea and difficult for the U.S. to get China to take the kind of action that we've hoped for. Meanwhile, the people living in the big glass houses, the leading nations, are afraid to throw cyber rocks from those houses for the most part. And so the U.S. has emphasized in our national doctrines that if you hit us with a cyber attack, we may respond over here with something else. Sanctions, tank fire, whatever it is, missiles. But to respond in kind with cyber, maybe, maybe not. But we're reserving the right to be asymmetrical in our response. Part of it is a lot of people have spent a lot of years sizing up each other in the cyber battlefield, and one wonders what's already out there in systems that is problematic. And so once you start pulling those triggers, you worry about what triggers are already in place against you, and it becomes very difficult to make those choices. Foreign investment, when I became Deputy Assistant AG for National Security, I had never worked on foreign investment matters, and I didn't understand much of that world, and most people don't because it's basically a closed group, CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., that does these things. They make a national security review of foreign investment transactions into the U.S. that affect national security interests. And in my capacity, all of these came across my desk. And I became part of this committee and showing up at these meetings. This is, in my mind, a lot of the real battlefield going forward in terms of technology-based risk to the country. And every trade-off here is a difficult one because if you start banning those large foreign entities, say from China, you start putting conditions on them, and you think of, you think of the Huawei situation, or recent export sanctions against ZTE, another massive Chinese state-owned entity, and you realize that each step against one of these entities is a potential retaliation against Cisco and other companies trying to operate in China. And that's that's a huge trading partner. It's easier to be hard on sanctions on Russia, with which we have very relatively small surface area from a trade perspective. Much harder with China and others, and so you see countries starting to really distrust one another in this space. China passed a new cybersecurity regulation that makes it very hard for U.S. companies to operate there unless you want to turn over the keys to your source code, turn over the keys to your intellectual property, give people access, use certain supply chains. You basically are going to sell your soul if you want to operate there under this regime. And it's got extraterritorial aspects to it as well in China, where if you provide a platform to a Chinese company, if you're an Amazon or someone like that, they purport to apply these controls to you, that you have to treat them a certain way, treat Chinese data a certain way. So it's a little bit of the EU's data protection, privacy issues we'll talk about, and a little bit of old school police state teeth combined into one. And they might say the same about the US. The US has not been terribly easy on these risks for the most part. So what have the government reactions been under the Obama administration? You see, on the one hand, law enforcement really trying to make things happen internationally, and we had a lot of success. I would go to a place like The Hague, the European Cybercrime Center, and the first time we would go, we'd have 8 countries that could participate in our operation, and the next time we'd have 11, and then 13, and then we were up by the time Dave's office did the dark code operation, they were up to 24 or more countries, and you see all sorts of nations participating in multinational operations from a law enforcement perspective. The government passed sanction tools to go after people for cyber thefts, in particular of intellectual property, that you don't have to show, for example, the trail of the hackers, but you can see that For example, DuPont loses its titanium dioxide formula in a hack, and all of a sudden, magically, a plant goes up in China with no R&D or lead time. We have a legal phrase for that. It's called res ipsa loquitur. It speaks for itself. You know, that's not happening unless you stole it. And so this sanction authority allows you to go after those parties. Some of the sanctions have been against governments like North Korea. That sanction tool I'm referring to is against individuals and private entities to try to deprive them of their ability to take the fruits of that stolen information and market it and profit from it. The government has really pushed sharing, and this has been helpful. I've been part of these efforts. Industry sharing across, within sectors, across sectors, and then with the government. And this was in an era when you couldn't pass any law. Pretty much the only law Congress could pass was on cyber information sharing in December 2015. And our teams worked on the implementing legislation for the, or regulation for this to make it happen, and it's starting to grow. People are seeing the value of sharing threat information. Most of it is anonymized. They're afraid to put customer names and things in there, and many of them are afraid even to put their own name in there. So they have the option to put this into a filter without giving away who they are. There's been a push to say that we're classifying too much stuff. You know, we are not here to be voyeurs. We're here to use some of this information, and if it can stop the next people from being victimized, we should be putting it out there, or warning them, giving them a classified read-in where possible, or declassifying the information in the first place more aggressively. Regulators have jumped in and tried to really enforce standards, especially in the financial sector. We used to laugh that there were no standards 2-3 years ago, and then people poked fun at the National Institute of Standards and Technology's very flexible, guidance-based cybersecurity standard in 2014, saying, oh, well, that's not really rigid enough. Now they really want it back because everybody's jumped in the pool. All these state regulators and everybody has a soapbox and a new regulation, and it's increasingly taking your choices away. It's increasingly prescriptive and very costly for businesses to comply. And you have now a patchwork just in the US before you even get to Europe of regulations to apply to you, especially if you're in the financial sector. Ironically, some other sectors like energy, from a cybersecurity standpoint, it's relatively still voluntary. So it just tells you things are all over the map in these different sectors. The EU, there's been 3 big priorities in the EU: privacy, privacy, and privacy. They're really focused on privacy. They're way more advanced on privacy than the US has been, and way less mature than we've been on cybersecurity. And so there's some sort of a correction going on. It's ugly, but it's being corrected. This GDPR is what everybody's talking about in my little geek law world. This is very scary. This regulates the transfer of data of EU citizens around the world and carries with it whopping fines, up to 4% of your annual gross turnover, aggregated across all your affiliates and everyone. So the penalties are potentially existential, and people are very worried. What happened is, in the wake of the Snowden revelations, that was a tipping point on data transfer issues, where the structure called the safe harbor that had been the framework for transferring data to and from Europe for companies was now eliminated by the European Court of Justice, as we don't have assurance that US intelligence agencies aren't going to see that stuff, so we're taking this away. It's up to you companies to come up with your own bespoke solutions for this, which is very costly. So now the US scrambled, and with Europe put in place the Privacy Shield, Safe Harbor 2.0, enhanced standards, rights to complain, an ombudsperson to receive your complaints if you think your stuff has been violated, and we don't know what's going to happen with that. It has not made it to the ECJ, but it has made it through regulatory scrutiny. You have national strategies coming out that increasingly look like the US's, and new laws in China and France and elsewhere that look a lot like forcing data localization, balkanization of this precious internet resource that we tried to create as an open platform. And so we're in a recoil stage now where people are pulling in their stuff nationalistically, and the effect on global business, trade, free flow of things is going to be hard for a while until we figure out a way to do it. Data localization is, of course, part of that. So I was part of this discussion on a Friday night a year and a half ago. I got a call, can you please come to the White House? The Chinese would like to negotiate a cyber accord overnight. They had been in town for a couple days in the lead up to President Xi's visit. Obvious concern about the cyber issues mounting, the tension between the countries, and this was a potential source of embarrassment for President Xi's visit, his first state visit. So this was a chance to find a moment in time when their needs and ours were relatively aligned and have a difficult conversation overnight that led to a modest 5 points on the page that supposedly, as to the theft of trade secrets, which were going on in huge droves where Chinese nation-state hackers were penetrating U.S. corporate interests, stealing trade secret information and providing it to their own competitors in China, that activity is reported by the security research community to be down dramatically. And so we hope that that will be the case. I mentioned CISA. These are the cross-sector ISAL and within sector ISAC initiatives for sharing, gives official government imprimatur to sharing this type of information. It's already been debunked that this is an antitrust issue or anything like that, but this gives specific government endorsement to these types of sharing organizations, and it's helping to reduce the threat and raise all boats a bit, if you will. I think I'm going to skip ahead in the interest of time. DHS is doing a ton of this work. They seem to be the winner in the Trump budget on cyber, getting $1.5 billion. Not sure who's getting what else of anything after that. That part is unclear, but they're doing great things at DHS. Still, not many people know or have taken advantage of these things fully, but there's a lot of these types of sharing platforms for private sector. So here, if we are going into an era of nationalism globally, and I mentioned the Dutch result and the fact that France may actually hang in there, but we do have other challenges, and there is this nationalistic push. And the implications, in my humble opinion, are potentially really significant. Let's start at the micro level. When you're talking about really that third and fourth bullet down, credibility on multinational operations and glue to hold enforcement operations together. None of the major operations I ever worked on, and this part never made it really to the public, none of them would have succeeded without relationships with people in countries around the world. I would often, when I was in Russia, they would ask me to speak about these issues, and they would say, Luke, why is it that you guys are able to do these multinational operations? We the Russians want to be part of that. And they would say to me, would it be if we amended our code this way? And do we need this extra subsection here? Do we need that? Could you train us on doing these? And I would say, guys, look, you need three things to do these cases. Number one, you need good laws, but probably not as good as you think. Number two, they would ask about technology. Don't you have some special tools? You need good technology, but not as good as you think. What really drives these cases are relationships of trust. In the trenches, ideally, but with official support and cover on top. If you're a place like Russia, you're not going to have any in the trenches support without it's very top down. Nobody moves left or right without official permission or cover on the top within the government there. Here, people will take the initiative to do their own thing, and they're given more license creatively to make an operation work. And they'll get that blessing, but they can let it develop and they can do a lot of things in their own discretion. But these international operations depended on trust, goodwill, a perception that the U.S. and others were there in everyone's interest in The Hague and other places we went around the world. And if we didn't have that credibility, these would fall apart. There's too many differences in the laws, policies, capabilities. You really need to know one another almost personally, really personally, to make it work well. The same is true with sharing. I'll get to it in a minute, but the official mechanism for sharing evidence around the world is a terribly broken system. The treaty system that we have is very broken. It's way too slow. It doesn't do a good job of catching old school bank robbers, let alone modern cyber criminals. It just doesn't. And so what has made up for that is the ability of police to police and prosecutor to prosecutor communications and relationships to make sure that we can get what we need now and we can paper it on the slow boat later as we get to trial a year or two from now. We can let the slow treaty process work, but we really need to stop the terrorists, stop the cyber criminal, whatever it is, now. We just can't let it go on for another 2 years while we wait for some piece of paper to go over a literal fax machine. So these kind of things are driven by relationships of trust, and I worry that if we're going into this nationalistic, us first, our interests first, and we're advertising that left and right, that we're actually going to hurt ourselves. Foreign investments is already smoldering. I went on a delegation with Susan Rice's team on the bilateral investment treaty with China a year and a half or so ago, something like that. And it's already tense. It's already really tense between the countries on foreign investment. So if you're going to have a trade war type talk and tough language, we have to all realize the implications of this. Yes, we need changes. We need to get on the same page. But if we pour too much fuel on that fire right now, we're gonna have a full-out trade war because there's already a simmering one under the table. Further data localization and balkanization. We've had this pre-nationalism. Now with nationalism driving things from a rhetorical standpoint, if nothing else, it doesn't inspire trust in anyone. And then multinational businesses decide to retreat and recoil because of that. And I just met with a very creative company that does a lot of amazing things in the financial sector, aggregating data and pulling feeds. And I said, well, how do you manage it with Europe? Oh, we don't go there. Why? Oh, because of the regulation. We just can't. We can't operate there. So European citizens don't benefit from that. No, sorry. We just can't. We tried. We could do it so well, but it's just too burdensome. So that's what we're into right now. I'm going to skip that. Trump cyber. These are a lot of the same issues from a different angle. If you're, on that second bullet, if you're the European Court of Justice, do you feel warm and fuzzy about upholding the privacy shield? I don't know. Maybe you say to yourself, there appears to be tremendous mistrust between the US president and his intelligence community. I don't know. Maybe that cuts in favor of upholding the privacy shield because maybe there's a feeling that because of that mistrust, the White House has less control over the intelligence community. And so there should be more mistrust. If there is a lot of control, maybe the type of nationalistic rhetoric we're seeing could be problematic. I don't know. But the implications are pretty huge if any of this tips what is really going to be a close, I think, decision the wrong way for businesses and everybody that needs to transfer data internationally. Are we going to carry our tough talk into more cyber action against adversaries? And if so, what does it look coming back at us? Remember the glass house analogy that I gave? It's real. We better get to work on locking down our critical infrastructure and so forth if we're going to throw punches in the cyberspace. I'm getting increasing numbers of questions on active defense What I mean there is, the pejorative term is hacking back. Look, we know you're our lawyer, but we have this SWAT team of people here at our institution. We're tired of seeing our stuff, on this file share overseas. We want to hit back at these people, or at least let us go in and delete our files. So I'm getting more of these questions now since the election because I think people are feeling a little bit John Wayne, I don't know, where they're feeling definitely emboldened and empowered, and you worry about what that means. That said, there's a big gray area with active defense that the U.S. government has really failed to address. They've just simply said, hacking back is bad, don't do it, we might prosecute you. But there's a lot between hacking back and a lot of other tools that don't destroy or hurt anyone that could track your file or self-delete your file. There's a lot of unanswered question there. You see people talking about resorting to offshore solutions where, well, you've got U.S. jurisdiction here. What if I hire those people over there to take this action that I can't take legally here? So these are real questions if we're going into an age of tough talk and nationalism here. What does industry need? I'm going to shut up in a minute and let you guys ask questions. What we need in industry, and this is my life now again, coming back to private practice, but I see it now through the cyber lens, is we need flexible guidelines-based regulation. How we got in trouble with cybersecurity writ large is by relying on the IT department and technology, by putting everything on their backs and expecting them to be Superman and Superwoman, not realistic, not an appreciation of how the threat actually happens. There's an art to this. There's an art to risk management. And so the answer from a regulatory standpoint, legal standpoint, in my opinion, is not to give an E equals MC squared regulatory solution either, but it's to make it flexible and reflective of the art that it is, choices that you are going to make. You'll see regulators hire a person who knows about technology, tell them some things, and then they promulgate a proposed regulation that says something that just doesn't work in the trenches. An example is we're thinking about requiring you to have a recovery time objective of 2 hours. Well, that's great, but you don't want to throw your system up online if you haven't gotten rid of the hacker or the malware, and you're going to propagate it around the world when you take your system back up online. So, there's a risk management dynamic that you just can't necessarily codify. You should be codifying the guidelines, principles, and general standards that people need to adhere to. MLAT overhaul, we need to do it completely differently. And I understand Justice is working on this, but for years, it literally has been over a fax machine that there's a 6 to 9 month delay between faxes where we send you this request we never talked to you about before. You either lose it or don't respond to it in time. We send you back an answer that says you're missing something. Then maybe we'll meet once a year and we'll sit down and we'll say, did you get that fax we sent you? I don't know. Sergey, could you go check? How about you, Sally? Did we send you that? I thought we sent you that back. I mean, that's pretty mid-20th century. What we need is a continuous contact through video conferencing or other things. Rather than twice a year seeing each other and clinking glasses, let's talk every 2 to 3 weeks on video. Let's put up a file share where we can post on a secure file share each party's documents. We're already giving them to each other. They're already on electronic systems. We can control one file share with PDFs to show you our request letter, your response. This could actually happen pretty seamlessly if we overhauled it. Norms of behaviors for nation states. The Russians were always asking us, what are you going to do if Russian hacker, at public conferences, what are you going to do if Russian hackers take down your financial system? Will you launch the missiles against us? Will you attribute it to us? Well, we should have norms. We should discuss these issues. Maybe we should do a tabletop exercise or two together. I do these for companies now. We did these as the government, where we spin out a scenario that starts small, gets worse, gets really doomsday, becomes all Tom Clancy by the end, you know, you maybe if you did this with the Russians or Chinese, you would understand how each other would react. You're taking some risks because you're showing some cards at the table, but probably better than them having somebody push the button prematurely. I talked ad nauseum about the transfer rules. How law enforcement interacts with companies has gotten way better. The FBI and the Secret Service are no longer overrunning your lobby with raid jackets. They're not asking to take over your systems. They're getting much more tactful and skillful about how they operate with companies. Lawyers like me who used to run those interactions from the government side now can take advantage of that for our clients, get more of them to come forward. The government receives more information. The company is not afraid. There's more predictability, and everybody wins. We need to continue doing that. We need to be strong on intellectual property, and here's my little speech about that. This is not clinical, but it has a clinical component. If you sit across the table from enough hardcore organized crime type people in negotiations as a prosecutor, you start to realize something, and it depends where they're coming from and their background. But the ones that we, you know, the real veteran ones, grizzled ones, are not impressed by emotional waving your arms and flailing and threatening them with things. They only understand the clinical response, that if they pull this lever, there's a smack. Whatever, let's call it this smack. They understand that you're not, you know, you're responding consistently and not politically in a particular situation. And you can say, Luke, this is naive because politics run the world. Well, you know, it also sends mixed signals on when you're going to enforce your laws. I think it's much more persuasive just to say to somebody in a calm, measured voice, if you do that again, we're going to respond in a visible way that will hurt you. And then you respond. So no red lines, no false whatever, no yelling and screaming and canceling the meeting because we're mad, but a clinical, consistent response. This is my view of what actually works in these types of enforcement situations, and I think it works at the macro level with governments as well. And then on foreign investment, it's this black box, and none of us is at liberty to talk about what happens in the black box or what factors or considerations go into it, and I think it's time for us as a government to rethink that. We're now in a situation where we're interconnected with countries like China on trade, and if they've got their black box and we've got our black box and nobody knows why everybody's transactions are being denied and rejected, it becomes harder to sort it out. And so there needs to be a faster process, a more transparent process for doing this, in my view. And these kinds of things would really help us. Just some last thoughts. I think I've talked about most of these. A lot of what we did as the Justice Department that is now threatened to be cut is promoting law enforcement cooperation around the world, going out and training people, building capacity in countries around the world. And when you realize in an inherently international space like cyber that your only success is as good as your counterparty's ability to be your partner in the operation, you have to go out and meet with them. You have to go out and train them. You have to build that capacity and be there consistently as a partner. If you only call in the emergency, it's not good. It's not good. And we say this to companies here. If you don't know the name and cell phone of the FBI or Secret Service person that you're going to call, when a cyber incident happens, you're already behind. We spent years building these networks in Germany, Turkey, Japan, all over the world of trusted partners, training with them, breaking bread with them, and spending the taxpayers' money to do it, to go and meet, train, work together. And so we can't, in my view, it's a threat to recoil and not continue that level of engagement, or at least we need to be eyes wide open on recognizing the costs. Because if we can't make the operations go, the cost to us ultimately as taxpayers is much greater. I've said way more than you probably wanted to hear, so I'm going to shut up and let you ask some questions.
Add microphone.
Good, is working here? Okay. I guess my question is, you made a couple of comments about like modernizing the MLAT process, for example, and talked about how you were chosen for cybersecurity work because you were the youngest guy in the room, and like jokes like that still kind of land. I think that because there's some truth to it. Is there some, like, I guess, what is the hindrance to some of what you want based on just technological know-how? Like, is there a complexity piece or a sort of like, we don't know what even certain things mean in cyber, so it makes it harder for people to adopt what you're thinking about? Does that make sense?
You know, I think it's about communication in the modern age. And, you know, for example, our firm has offices all over the world. And our cyber team convenes every other week globally on video. And we can all see each other. And, you know, our government does this, and we have the capability, and so do the other leading countries. And so we're talking about simple video conferencing. We're talking about a simple shared file directory where each country has the password and can go in and see the sequence of documents segmented there. They're already on systems. They're already being traded and faxed. It's a question of, does this raise the risk level anyway? You know, so you have a room designated for these video conferences, and you don't conduct other business there because you're worried somebody might remotely access the camera or do something like that. Those risks already exist. So you might as well take the acceptable level of risk that you already have and apply simple modern technology that is actually way cheaper than flying and spending, I mean, still go to see each other. There's no substitute for that, but that's my view, is that we could do some really simple basic things to communicate more often, share the documents timely. Something that I worked on in Russia that I really was proud of, and it was just a modest thing, was looking around the embassy and seeing unutilized people like the DHS investigators that were special agents, FBI, others, many of them sitting waiting for their Russian counterparts to call or do something. And I said, why don't we form a working group with the Russians where before they fax something to us or a treaty request, we put the paper on the table. Let's look at it with our already paid, already in-country resources, experienced eyes to say, you know what, let me ask my agency if we already have a case on this guy. And then we don't need your MLAT request. We can give you the documents. We'll get a grand jury release from the court in Pittsburgh or wherever. Or you've asked for these bank records, but you left out these categories that we would want if we were you. You should ask for those. Oh, okay. Or there's a gap in your proof. Can you connect these dots? Otherwise it's going to get bounced. So if you just had this communication at a table, my first conversation with the Russians was like, why would we ever sit at a table with agents? I'm like, we have a computer term, garbage in, garbage out. Think of your file the same way as a prosecutor. In a cyber case, somebody hands you a file that you never met, you didn't have any process in shaping, chances are it's not usable. You know, we shoulder up as teammates with our investigators and agents, and we wanted to model for them a modern way of working and get better results for ourselves. Great question.
In fashioning a bilateral agreement, what role does things like a due process play? And reason why I say that is it seems like it's easier to strike a deal with another country saying, if you turn over your citizens to be prosecuted in our courts, we guarantee that they'll get a fair trial, so they'll have procedural protections, so on and so forth. So does that make cooperation easier between governments, or?
Great question. Yeah, and it's a barrier when it's not there. So take the Russia example. Russia does not extradite its nationals as a constitutional matter. We extradite our nationals. We don't extradite them to just anybody. We want to make sure they're going to get a fair trial and they're going to have due process where they land, to your question. But with that disparity, we sit at the table and frequently bang our heads against the wall with governments that won't extradite their nationals. And a lot of things drive good and bad from that. The rule of law is the reason we have, the reason we have iPhones in our pockets and things is because we have rule of law in this country to protect that development, and nobody's going to take it from them. There's a striking overlap between countries that don't extradite their nationals and countries that are lacking in rule of law. If we could trust them to bring a prosecution against their own nationals that would actually be legitimate, we would maybe not make the extradition request that we know is going to be denied anyway because it's not a citizen. We would have, more important is what I should say than extraditing your nationals is having rule of law and due process. And if your own citizen is committing a crime affecting another country, actually prosecuting them and holding them to task, even if you're not willing to extradite them. But yes, it's a barrier. It's a real issue when you have a disparity in extradition views.
Thank you. My question expands to another problematic field, which has to do with terrorism. How good has been terrorists using the cyber warfare, and how good has the government has been using the cyber security to fight terrorism?
Thank you so much for asking that. I should have mentioned that in the time that I was in government, terrorist use of cyber went from just propaganda and recruiting to actual operational support and operations using cyber means. They started to use hacked information to put targeting packages together against American service personnel and other government officials in a way that was very troubling and scaring in a publicly reported case that I was part of overseeing. So we've gotten much more effective at stopping terrorists, and we've been much more streamlined about sharing intelligence information with law enforcement. Everybody's learned the 9/11 lesson the hard way. And those walls, literal walls, went down, and sharing was enhanced. I think, to your question, we need to apply some of the same approaches to cyber crime and other cybersecurity issues, where we need to separate stopping it from happening now from the slower process of prosecution and extradition. We need to have more rapid interdiction of, an authority to do that than waiting for eventual evidence to come, whatever it's going to come by, or an extradition of a person. Those things inherently take time to be done right through due process, but there needs to be an ability to thwart the attacks now. Good question.
Luke, we have reached that 1 hour mark you mentioned. So I want to invite people to continue the discussion, but to continue it up on second floor in the Alcoa room where we have a reception. But before we do that, two things I think are in order. One is, thank you, Luke, for a tremendous, comprehensive discussion